The day my parents handed my sister a check for $100,000, I was standing right there in that kitchen. I watched my mother slide that envelope across the counter like it was nothing, like it was a birthday card, like it was a $20 bill for pizza. And my sister just smiled, tucked it into her purse, and said thank you the same way you'd thank someone for passing the salt. I didn't say a word. I just stood there holding a casserole dish I'd brought over for Sunday dinner, feeling something cold move through my chest that I still don't have a name for. That was the moment I realized that everything I had told myself about my family for 34 years was a lie. My name is Rachel, and I need to tell you what happened. Not because I want sympathy and not because I'm bitter, though I'll admit there were months where bitter doesn't even begin to cover it. I'm telling you this because I spent so long thinking I was the problem, thinking I was the one who didn't try hard enough or love hard enough or show up in the right ways. And if even one person hears this and recognizes themselves in it, then it was worth saying out loud. I grew up in a middle-class family in Ohio. My dad worked in logistics for 30 years, steady and reliable, the kind of man who came home at the same time every evening and never raised his voice. My mom was a substitute teacher who ran a tight household, clipped coupons, and made sure we never went without, at least not visibly. On the surface, we were completely normal. Sunday dinners, family vacations to the same lake every summer, Christmas mornings where everyone smiled for the photo albums my mother kept in careful chronological order on the living room shelf. And then there was my sister Diane. Diane is 3 years older than me, and from the time I can remember, she was the center of everything. Not because she demanded it exactly, but because my parents just naturally oriented toward her. She was louder, more dramatic, more expressive in the way that some people just are. When she cried, everyone noticed. When she succeeded, everyone celebrated. When she struggled, it became a family emergency. I'm not saying she was a bad person, I'm saying the dynamic was set in stone before I was old enough to understand what was happening. I learned very young how to be quiet, how to handle things myself, how to not ask for too much. By the time I was in high school, I had made peace with it in the way that kids do when they don't have another option. I was the responsible one. The one who got good grades without anyone asking, who worked a part-time job at 16 without being told to, who figured out her own college applications because nobody sat down and walked through them with her. Diane had gotten that. My parents had spent weeks on her applications, visiting campuses, helping her write her essays. By the time my turn came, my mom said she was just so exhausted from all of that and handed me a pamphlet from the community college and told me to look into scholarships. I did. I found them myself. I applied myself. I got into a 4-year university on a partial scholarship and took out loans for the rest, and my parents told everyone at church that both their daughters had gone to college, like it was an equal accomplishment for all of us. I didn't say anything about that either. After graduation, I moved 2 hours away, started working in healthcare administration, built a life steadily and quietly the way I'd always done everything. I got a small apartment, then a better one. I met a man named David. We dated for 3 years. We got married in a small ceremony that my parents attended but didn't contribute to financially because they said they were saving for something important. I found out 2 years later they meant Diane's wedding, which they paid for almost entirely, down to the venue deposit and the flowers. When David and I asked them for help with the down payment on our first house, my father sat across from us at the kitchen table and said very calmly that they just didn't have that kind of money to spare. He said it with a straight face. He said it like it was simply the truth. We bought our house without help. We scraped together every dollar we had, borrowed a small amount from David's parents, and made it work. We were proud of it, genuinely. A little 3-bedroom on a quiet street. We painted every room ourselves over a long holiday weekend. I remember thinking that we'd done something real, something we could be proud of, and part of me was even glad we hadn't needed anyone else's help. 2 months after we moved in, Diane bought a house 4 times the size of ours. I found out because she posted photos online. It was a beautiful house. A 5-bedroom colonial in a new development with a finished basement and a backyard with a deck. I remember staring at those photos thinking, good for her, genuinely. She was always the one who reached for more, and that was fine. Then my mother called me to tell me how proud she was of Diane, and in the conversation she mentioned almost in passing that they had helped Diane with her down payment. A significant contribution, she said. I asked how much, and there was a pause, and she said, well, enough to really make it possible for her. I didn't push, I should have, I just changed the subject. That was 6 years ago. And in those 6 years, the help kept flowing toward Diane in ways I only saw pieces of at a time. There was money for her car when hers broke down. There was a loan they gave her for a business idea she had that didn't pan out, and when I asked my dad years later if she'd paid it back, he looked vaguely uncomfortable and said it had been worked out between them. There were months my mom mentioned covering some of Diane's bills because she was going through a hard time. Every single time I was told this as background information, not as something that concerned me, just family news. I was never going through a hard time, apparently, at least not one my parents noticed. In reality, David and I had a very hard year when our daughter was born with some medical issues that required specialist appointments and therapies not covered by our insurance. We paid tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket over 18 months. I told my parents about it not to ask for help, but because they were her grandparents and they deserved to know what their granddaughter was going through. My mother said she would pray for her and brought over a casserole. My father said that they really admired how capable David and I were. That was it. I carried that year in my body for a long time. I carried the exhaustion and the financial fear and the quiet grief of going through something hard with no net beneath you. But I got through it. We got through it. And I kept showing up to Sunday dinners and asking how Diane was doing and bringing food and sending cards and being what I had always been in that family. I want to tell you something about the particular kind of pain that comes from being overlooked by the people who are supposed to love you most. It doesn't feel like cruelty at first, it feels like confusion. Like maybe you're misreading things, like maybe you're being too sensitive, like maybe there's some version of reality where everything is actually fair and you're just missing the context. You spend years in that confusion, explaining it away, making excuses on their behalf, telling yourself it's not about love, it's just how they are. And then one Sunday in March, you're standing in your mother's kitchen holding a casserole dish, and you watch an envelope get pushed across a counter, and something inside you finally stops explaining. I didn't walk out. I sat down at the table and had dinner with my family and watched Diane talk excitedly about what she planned to do with the money. It was for a new business venture, an interior design studio she'd always dreamed of opening. My parents were glowing. My father said he believed in her completely. My mother said it was finally Diane's time to shine. I ate my food, I helped clear the table, I kissed everyone goodbye. I sat in my car in their driveway for a long time before I drove home. When I walked in the front door, David took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" And I told him everything. All of it, not just that night, but all of it, everything I had minimized and filed away and excused over 34 years. It came out in a way that surprised me, calm and clear, like I had been waiting for the exact right moment to finally say all of it out loud. David listened to everything, then he said, "I want you to hear something and I need you to really hear it." He said, "You have been the most giving, most patient person in that family and they have taken advantage of it for your entire life, and I think you know that now." I did know it, I'd known it for a long time. What I didn't know was that the $100,000 was just the beginning of what I was about to find out. It started when my Aunt Clara called me the following week. Clara is my father's older sister, and she and my mother had never been particularly close, which meant Clara had always been a little outside the orbit of my family's carefully maintained narrative. She had a habit of saying things plainly that other people danced around. She said she had heard about the money and she wanted to talk to me about something. She said she thought I deserved to know some things that had been kept from me. I drove to her house that Saturday. She made coffee and sat me down at her kitchen table and told me that when my grandfather died 11 years ago, he had left money to be divided among his children and specifically designated that a portion was set aside for each grandchild's future. My father was one of 3 children, and each grandchild was supposed to receive a meaningful inheritance. I had never received anything. I sat very still when she told me that. I asked her to say it again and she did. She said my grandfather had left clear instructions that the money had been distributed through my father to his children and that she had always assumed I had received my portion. She said she had thought about it over the years and felt uneasy, and when she heard about the $100,000 gift to Diane, something clicked for her. I asked her how much had been designated for each grandchild. She thought for a moment and said she believed it was somewhere around $40,000 based on what she knew of the estate at the time. I drove home in a kind of silence that was different from any silence I'd experienced before. It wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to think. It was the silence of someone who is thinking very clearly and doesn't trust themselves to speak yet. I didn't confront my parents right away. I know that might seem strange, but I needed to be sure. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I walked into that house and said something I couldn't take back. I spent 2 weeks doing quiet research. I looked up my grandfather's obituary. I called a probate attorney just for a consultation, just to understand how estates work and how distributions are documented. I found out that estate records are public in our state, and with some patience and some help I was able to get a copy of the filed documents. There it was, in legal language that was still perfectly clear. Each grandchild of my grandfather named individually was designated a specific amount from the estate. My name was there, Diane's name was there, the amounts were equal. I had never received a cent. I want to tell you what it feels like to hold a document like that in your hands. It doesn't feel like vindication, not at first. It feels like the floor has dropped out. Because it means that for 11 years, every time I struggled, every time I scraped together money for medical bills or a house down payment or anything else, there was money that had been meant for me sitting somewhere else. And my father had known it the entire time. I thought about all the Sundays, all the casseroles I brought, all the times I said nothing when I should have said something, all the times I told myself maybe it's fair, maybe I'm missing something, maybe this is just how families are. I made an appointment with the attorney, not to sue anyone yet, just to understand what my options were, what the law said about this situation. The attorney was very straightforward with me. He said that if the estate had been distributed according to the documents and my portion had been redirected or withheld, that was potentially a serious matter. He said we would need more documentation, but that what I had was already significant. I went home and I wrote down everything I remembered, every conversation about money over the years, every time I'd been told there was nothing to spare, every gift I knew of that had gone to Diane. I wrote it all down with dates and details, and I kept that document on my personal laptop with a backup in the cloud. Then I called my sister. This part is complicated, I want to be honest about that. Diane is not entirely innocent in this story, but I also don't think she is the villain of it. The villain is a pattern of favoritism that my parents built and maintained and that Diane simply benefited from. She didn't steal from me directly. She just accepted what was handed to her the way most people would. But when I called her and carefully, without revealing everything I knew, started asking questions about whether she knew anything about our grandfather's estate, her answer told me a great deal. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "What exactly are you asking?" And something in her tone told me she wasn't completely in the dark. I asked her directly if she had received anything from grandfather's estate when he died, and she said yes, she had. She said Dad had handled it and given her the money a few months after the funeral. She said she'd assumed I had gotten mine separately. I asked if she had ever wondered why I never mentioned it, and there was a very long pause, and she said, "Honestly, Rachel, I didn't think about it. I'm sorry, I think I just didn't think about it." That honesty actually helped me. I'm not sure why. Maybe because after so many years of people in my family not seeing me, being seen even in a painful moment felt like something. The confrontation with my parents happened on a Tuesday evening in April. I didn't want to do it at Sunday dinner with everyone present. I called my father and asked if David and I could come over to talk about something important. He said of course, using the tone he always used when he assumed everything was fine and this was just a regular visit. We sat in the living room, my mother made tea that nobody drank, and I placed a copy of my grandfather's estate documents on the coffee table, and I asked my father to explain what had happened to my inheritance. I have never seen my father look the way he looked in that moment. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was the look of a man who had convinced himself for 11 years that he had made the right call and who was now sitting across from the proof that he had not. He said he had managed the distribution based on what he felt was best for the family. He said Diane had been going through a very difficult time when grandfather died and that the money had been used to help her stabilize. He said he had always intended to make it right with me, but that the timing was never ideal, and 1 year became 2, and then it had been so long that he didn't know how to bring it up. My mother said almost nothing. She looked at my father the way she always looked at him when something uncomfortable was happening, waiting for him to handle it. I asked my father if he understood what he was describing. I said it as calmly as I could. I said, "You received money designated for me from my grandfather's estate and gave it to Diane without telling me." I said, "While I was paying out of pocket for my daughter's medical care and scraping together every dollar for a house, my inheritance was sitting somewhere else." He said he was sorry. He said it quietly and he seemed to mean it. But sorry was sitting in a room with 11 years of everything that had not been said, and it was very small. I told him I had spoken with an attorney. I told him I was not there to threaten him. I was there because he was my father and I wanted to give him the chance to make this right before it became something else. My mother started crying at that point. She said she couldn't believe I would do this to the family. She said I was making everything about money. She said she'd always known I was resentful and this proved it. And that right there was when something final shifted in me. I had spent 34 years managing my own reactions so that other people in that room could be comfortable. I had swallowed hurt and confusion and legitimate anger because I loved my parents and I didn't want to be the one who caused a scene. I had minimized myself so many times that I'd started to wonder if there was actually something wrong with me, if I was truly as undeserving as I had been treated. I looked at my mother and I said, "I'm not making this about money. I'm making it about the fact that my grandfather left me something and it was taken from me." I said, "And I need you to hear this, the money was one thing, but knowing that you have watched me struggle for years without saying a word about this is something I will not be explaining away anymore." I stood up. David stood up next to me. My father asked us to stay, said we could work it out. My mother was still crying. I said I would hear from them when they were ready to have a real conversation, and we left. The weeks after that were some of the hardest and some of the most clarifying of my life. My mother called several times, alternating between tearful apologies and accusations that I was destroying the family. Diane called once and said she felt terrible about everything and that she was going to talk to my parents about making it right. My father sent one text that said simply, "I know I was wrong, I'm thinking about how to fix this." I gave it space. I didn't call anyone back right away. I talked to David, I talked to my therapist, I talked to Clara, who was outraged on my behalf in a way that was both validating and a little exhausting. I worked through what I actually wanted from this situation. I asked myself if I wanted money, if I wanted an apology, if I wanted a relationship with my family, and what those things were worth to me. The attorney laid out my options clearly. I had a legitimate claim. The documentation was solid. If I chose to pursue it formally, it would be costly and painful and might result in a legal judgment in my favor, but would almost certainly end my relationship with my parents. He told me to take my time. What happened next was not what I expected. 3 weeks after that Tuesday evening, my father called me. He asked if he could come to our house, just him, without my mother. I said yes. He sat in our kitchen, which was so different from the kitchen I'd grown up in, smaller and less polished and full of our daughter's drawings on the refrigerator, and he looked like a man who had been doing a lot of sitting with himself. He said he had made a decision. He said he had spoken with a financial advisor and that he was going to make restitution. The full $40,000 from grandfather's estate, plus interest calculated from the date of distribution. He said he had also done some honest thinking about the pattern over the years, about the house and the medical bills and everything else, and that he and my mother wanted to address those things too in whatever way we were willing to accept. He said he was not asking me to forgive him immediately. He said he just wanted me to know he understood for the first time clearly that he had failed me, not once but consistently over a long period of time, and he was sorry. I'm not going to tell you I cried, though I did. I'm not going to tell you it fixed everything, because it didn't. What I will tell you is that it was the first time in my entire life that I felt like my father actually saw me. Not the easy, capable, no-trouble version of me he had used to justify ignoring my needs, but me actually. The person who had been hurt and overlooked and had carried it quietly for decades. We are not back to Sunday dinners yet. I don't know if that's where we'll end up. My mother has apologized in the halting, self-protective way that some people apologize when they are more sorry for the consequences than the action, and I am taking that for what it is. Diane and I have had 2 long conversations that were honest in ways we have never managed before, and there is something being rebuilt there that I'm cautiously hopeful about. The money arrived in my account 6 weeks after my father's visit. I sat and looked at it for a long time. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like having something returned that had always belonged to me. David and I used part of it to finally take our daughter on a trip we had been putting off for years. We stood on a beach in Florida in the early morning, just the 3 of us, watching the water come in. My daughter ran toward the waves the way kids do, with absolute fearless joy, and David put his arm around me and I just stood there and let myself feel it. All of it, not just the good parts. I want to say something to anyone who is still in the middle of what I was in. Still explaining it away, still wondering if you're misreading it, still quietly absorbing the message that you don't deserve what was given so easily to someone else. The confusion you're living inside is not a character flaw. It is what happens when the people who were supposed to be your safe place spend years being the exact opposite, and you have no frame of reference for how wrong that is. You are allowed to stop managing everyone else's comfort. You are allowed to look at the facts clearly. You are allowed to say, this is not okay, and I am not going to keep pretending that it is. It took me 34 years to say it, but I said it, and it changed everything that came after. I don't think my parents are evil people. I think they are people who made a choice quietly and repeatedly to prioritize one child over another, and who never examined that choice because it was easier not to. I think my father knows now, really knows what that cost me, and I think my mother is closer to knowing than she has ever been, even if she isn't fully there yet. As for me, I am closer to peace than I have ever been. Not because everything is resolved, because it isn't. Not because the family is whole and healed, because it's not. But because I am no longer carrying the weight of my own silence, and that, it turns out, is worth more than I ever knew. There's a version of this story that ends with me alone, where I make the hard choice and the family fractures completely, and I grieve the loss of something that was never quite real to begin with. That would have been a valid ending too. And if you are in a situation where that is the outcome, I want you to know that is not a failure. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for yourself is stop holding together something that was never holding you. But this version ended differently, imperfectly and slowly, and with a lot of things still unfinished, but differently. And I'm here, still building my life, still showing up for my daughter, still grateful to me in a kitchen in Ohio, and said out loud what I had been afraid to say for 30 years. There's one more thing I haven't told you yet, and it matters. About 2 months after my father made restitution, I found out something that added another layer to everything I thought I already understood. It came from the most unexpected place, a box of old papers my Aunt Clara was cleaning out from her attic, papers that had belonged to my grandfather. She called me and said she thought I should come look at something before she decided what to do with them. I drove to her house on a rainy Saturday and she handed me a letter. It was handwritten, dated about 6 months before my grandfather passed. It was addressed to my father, and it was from my grandfather himself. The letter was not long, but what it said stopped my breathing for a moment. My grandfather had written that he was worried about how my father treated his 2 daughters differently. He had noticed it during family visits over the years. He had noticed that Diane was doted on while I was quietly expected to manage on my own. He wrote that he was proud of the woman I had become, but that he worried no one was telling me that. He wrote that he specifically wanted his bequest to me to be handled carefully, directly, and without interference, and that he hoped my father would make things right if he hadn't already. He knew my grandfather had seen what my parents couldn't or wouldn't see, and he had tried, even from the end of his life, to do something about it. I held that letter for a long time without speaking. Clara sat across from me with her hands folded and gave me the silence to absorb it. I thought about my grandfather, who had been a quiet man himself, not unlike me in some ways, who had observed things carefully and said less than he noticed, who had in his final months written this letter and trusted that his son would honor it. My father had received that letter, he had read those words, and then he had done exactly what his father had asked him not to do. I kept a copy of that letter. I have it in the same folder as the estate documents. I don't know exactly what I'll do with it someday. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just something I need to have, proof that someone in that family saw me clearly, even if he couldn't say it while he was alive, in the ways that would have helped most. I showed it to David that night. He read it twice without saying anything. Then he looked up at me and said, "Your grandfather loved you." And I nodded because I couldn't speak, and because that simple sentence landed somewhere so deep in me that I felt it in my hands. I made a decision after that. I decided to share the letter with my father. Not as an accusation, not as another confrontation. I had already said what needed to be said, and he had already begun doing what needed to be done. I shared it because I thought he deserved to know that his father had seen the problem clearly, and had trusted him to be better than he had been, and that understanding that might matter to him in his own process of reckoning. I sent him a copy in the mail, old-fashioned maybe, but it felt right. I included a short handwritten note that said only, "I thought you should have this." He called me 4 days later. He was crying in a way I had never heard from my father before, not sobbing, but the kind of restrained, effortful crying of a man who doesn't do it easily and is doing it anyway. He said he had forgotten about the letter. He said he had read it when it arrived and had felt ashamed and had told himself he would make it right eventually and had then done what people do with shame when they don't know how to face it. He buried it. He kept moving. He let the years do what years do when you let them. He said reading it again, now after everything, was the hardest thing he had experienced in a long time. I told him I wasn't sharing it to hurt him. I told him I was sharing it because I thought we both needed to know that the truth had been visible all along, that it hadn't been invisible or subtle or a matter of interpretation, that my grandfather had named it clearly and trusted him with it, and it had still taken decades and a confrontation and legal documents for anything to shift. He said he understood. He said he was going to spend the rest of whatever time he had trying to show me that he understood. I don't know if he'll fully succeed at that. I think some damage is permanent in the way that deep wounds leave marks even after they close, but I believe he means it. And believing that a person means it, even when the road ahead is long, is not nothing. What changed most visibly over the following months was something I hadn't anticipated, which was my relationship with myself. I had spent so many years being the quiet one, the capable one, the one who didn't need anything, that I had actually started to believe it. I had built an identity around not asking, not needing, not making things difficult for anyone. And underneath that identity was a person who was exhausted and sad and who had never fully grieved the childhood she deserved and didn't get. I started therapy around the time all of this was unfolding.